just going to do a little bit of a summary of the 39th daf before we get to the 40th daf, but it will be so super quick, you wouldn't believe. Okay? So bottom line, there's a contradiction between the first and second ruling of the Mishnah. Basically, we don't know because it says if the ox of a deaf, muted, deranged person or minor gored the ox of a competent person, the owner is exempt. We see that in the case of a tam, the court doesn't appoint an agent to allow the damaged party to collect the half payment damage from the animal's body. In other words, even if the court appointed an agent to watch over the tam ox, the ox and gores, the agent is not empowered to collect the half damages from the body of the animal. But the second clause seems to contradict that in the Mishnah. It says, if the ox of a deaf, muted, deranged person or a minor gored, the court appoints for them an agent to watch over the ox. And the court accepts testimony regarding the oxen in the presence of the agent. So we see in the second part of the Mishnah that in the case of the tam, the court does appoint an agent allowing the damaged party to collect the half damage payment from the animal's body. In other words, in this case, the agent is empowered. So the two clauses are contradictory. So this is what Rava said in the second clause, is that basically the court does appoint for them an agent to watch over the oxen and accepts the testimony regarding the oxen in the presence of an agent. And we render the oxen muad so that if it goes again, there's an obligation to pay from choice property. Okay, that's how it started off. Then there was a second clause that doesn't speak about the empowerment of an agent to allow collection from the body of the tam, but is empowerment with regard to rendering the oxen muad. So we're saying, although the court doesn't authorize him with regard to the former, it authorizes him with regard to the latter, so it doesn't conflict. So the Mishnah rules that we appoint an agent to render the animal a muad. So in other words, to do account. So he's just there to accept testimony. Then basically the Gemara discusses, or is it taken from the choice property of an agent? Because Rav Yochanan said it's not taken from the choice property of the orphans, because creditors can't take from orphans movable property. And in the case of tam, remember it's the body of an attacking animal, it's movable property. But Rav Yossi Bar Chanina said you can only take from choice property once it becomes muad. So the bottom line of it is that how it works out is it's different in the case of a damager. Why? Because, and by the way, when it says minors, orphans, it's including in minors those that don't have the capacity to have full comprehension of consequences, including deaf mutes and deranged people. So we're saying, look, at the end of the day, it's different with regards to damager, because the whole, it means that the laws, people can't just be damaged. It's different if somebody grants a loan and then that person passes away and the kids, when they get older, they have to pay it from movable property. But at the time, you can't take from minors movable property, only from fixed assets. But it's different in the case of a damager, because a damager can't be expected to ruin the public with its damage. And even somebody that doesn't have the capacity to make the decision from whoever's taking care of the animal has to pay from those, the estate or the property of the mental incompetent, because it's damage. It's not as lenient as credit. Then the Gemara goes to the case where it's saying, look, we should actually take from the agent. Why? Because it was the agent whose care in the animal lay. But the reason we don't take from an agent is very simple, is because nobody would volunteer to pay that sort of money and take that responsibility. So basically we get from this that, look, what happened with the agent? I'm hearing a lot of my own voice in the background. I don't know if
I'm also hearing a massive noise as well. I'm betting to hear you properly. I thought it was just me.
Can you hear me now? Is there any issue?
No, now it seems much better.
Okay. So bottom line is that we're saying, look, The agent isn't apparently paid big bucks. What happens with the agent is very straightforward. Is the agent basically volunteers. I don't even know if he gets paid or he gets paid minimally. But from what I understand is that the agent is a court-appointed person that takes the tam ox to their jurisdiction. So he says, look, I'm prepared to look after it, maybe just pay for the food or whatever, nothing major, and I'll look after the animal. But if you're asking me to be responsible, cut me out. So the same thing as you go to Australia and you get somebody to look after your property and he's doing you a favor, which is called the unpaid custodian, unpaid guardian. In that case, he's saying, look, I'm looking after your place. If you're going to sue me for everything that goes wrong, get somebody else to look after your place. So that's why we don't make the agent pay. And we're hoping that the agent will feel so bad as causing mental incompetence to lose money that, in fact, he ends up being much more conscious. And maybe that's also one of the reasons that we don't make him empowered to collect from tam damages, okay? Because he's there just to accept looking after the animal and for the muad count. So maybe in that way, we're also giving the people that are mentally incompetent a bit of a chance. Then the Gemara goes on to the next part and says, look, at the end of the day, we're talking about there seems to be an issue. In other words, we're not sure if the question of whether the court appoints an agent in the case of a tam to allow the damaged party to collect the half payment damage from the animal's body is subject to a dispute between the Tanaim. Because we learned in a brisa, remember this, guys, that regarding an oxen whose owners have become deaf and mute, or whose owners have become deranged, or whose owners gone overseas in ox gored, Yehuda ben Nakusa said in the name of Sumchus, it remains in its tam state, but to Musa, until witnesses testify regarding it in the presence of their owners. But the sages say the court appoints for them an agent, and the court accepts testimony regarding the oxen in the presence of an agent. So what can we see from there so far, guys? We can see that Sumchus says, listen, Akiva's joined us. We'll just let him in, guys. Hi, Akivs. How's it, mate? Akiva.
Yeah.
How are you?
Yeah.
Good. It's lovely to see you.
Yeah, thank God. Good to see you guys too.
Good.
For at least on a Motzei Shabbos, I should try and join you.
Yeah, that would be nice. Guys, remember him. We recognize him. He looks familiar. Doesn't he look familiar? We're just ragging you, but basically, we're just talking in the Gemara of a case where Sumchus doesn't agree that the court appoints the agent to act with the powers to collect tam damages, but the sages say that that's not true. The court agent has the power to collect tam damages because that agent is the custodian of the animal because mentally incompetent people can't look after the animal. So that's the argument between the sages and Sumchus. We're just doing a bit of a review, kids.
Okay, no problem. I'll just follow along.
Yeah, okay. So there's a second ruling. So if the deaf mute regains hearing and speech, or the deranged person becomes sane, or the minor becomes an adult, the ox is basically or the owner comes back from overseas. Yehuda ben Nakusa said in the name of Sumchus, it returns to its tam state until witnesses testify about it in the presence of the owners. But Rav Yossi said it remains in its present muad state. So what's the contradiction, guys, we learned? We said, but hang on a second. Sumchus is saying, but to Muso, implying that it stays in its tam state. And basically here, it's saying that Yehuda ben Nakusa said in the name of Sumchus, it returns to its tam state, which means if it returns to its tam state, it meant it was muad, while it was goring in the presence of the agent. But now that the original owners have either come back from overseas or have developed their mental faculties, it goes back to a tam state. So we're saying something's wrong here. So the Gemara wants to say that, but to Musa doesn't mean that it stayed in the tam state and never became muad. It just means that it remains bit tam musa in terms of law. In other words, it remains tam in its entirety. In other words, entirely the property of the damager. So we're saying that, look, the court-appointed agent, according to Sumchus, firstly, has the power to look after the animal and to just do a muad count. But he does not have the power to make sure that any payments are made while it's in its tam state. So at the end of the day, we don't reduce the ownership by paying half payment damages from the body for the first 3 times. We see that Sumchus holds that in the case of a tam, the court does not appoint an agent to allow the damaged party to collect half damage payment from the animal's body. What do the sages say, guys? Guys, what do they say? How do they feel? Guys, you can unmute yourselves. Guys?
I'm the only one that's on mute. Everyone else can talk.
Yeah, I don't understand why nobody's saying anything.
Because we don't know.
All right.
So fun.
Look, guys, very simple. The sages say there's 2 different disputes. Sumchus already said, listen, the agent of the court can only do 2 things, is to look after the animal on behalf of mental incompetence and to make sure there's a count where the animal, in fact, becomes muad. Okay? But there's no tam damages that pays while it's in the care of the mental incompetence. And even if it becomes muad through the court agent, it reverts back to tam in the minute they gain their faculties. The sages turn around and say, of which Rav Yehuda, by the way, agrees, as well as Rav Yaakov agrees with the sages, that says, look, the court appoints an agent to collect for tam payments as well. There's no question as far as that's concerned. Okay. Then we go into the next section that discusses, look, there seems to be a separate issue, okay? And that issue is about domain jurisdictional issues. So Sumchus holds that basically coming under a new domain renders the ox from a muad state to a tam state, okay? And Rabbi Yossi said, no, it stays exactly in the state that it was. It stays in a muad state. Does that make sense, guys? And the sages also agree with that, many of the sages. All right, guys, just give me 1 second. I'm just trying to get this cat off this laptop. Just give me a sec.
Kev, you're not going for a run tomorrow then?
Nah, it's a fast day.
So why should you go slow then if it's a fast day?
Arthur.
Up we going. Right, guys, I'm back. All right. So then, basically, Rav Yossi holds that a new jurisdiction doesn't alter the status. Sumchus said it does. The animal goes back to being tam. Why does it come back to being tam? Do you remember the answer?
Because firstly, it's in a new jurisdiction, so it's going back to where it came from, and it's not really fair on that on the original owner that these guys that are incapacitated or retarded or whatever the issues are. It's not fair for them to inherit an animal now all of a sudden that they've got their mental faculties together.
Correct.
To inherit an animal that is muad.
Correct. Because they said, listen, while we were mentally incompetent or overseas, you were meant to do a decent job of looking after it. Now I've got to pay muad payment because you did a worse job than I could have done. Had it been under my care and I'd been retarded because I was in a slightly deranged state or whatever, it would have become muad anyway. Now it became muad under your care. What difference? Why were you even there? Exactly, Gavin. That's exactly.
Yeah, and he was in all probability negligent. That's how it became muad. If he did a secure guarding on a tam animal, then this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, you're saying the same thing, but absolutely, you're absolutely correct.
Just adding, I thought I left it out. Sorry.
Rav Yossi holds that the new jurisdiction doesn't alter its status, okay? So in terms of why, because if you're the person that was damaged, okay, you could say, look, why should I accept half payment damages now? That's your internal issue. That's between the courts and the mentally incompetent. What does it have to do with me as an innocent bystander? So you can see it from Rav Yossi's point of view as well.
Sure.
I think in the point in the Gemara is trying to see it from 2 points of view. All right, just a summary. Now we're nearly done. But now we've got a problem because Rav Yaakov pops in the equation and he says, Rav Yaakov pays half damages. Gemara says, what are you talking about? Rav Yaakov pays the damages. The Gemara said, no, that's not the wording. What we're saying is Rav Yaakov says that the owner pays half damages. So the Gemara says, well, we can't be dealing with a case of tam. Why can't we be dealing with a case of tam? Very simple. It's because if you say half damages and it's a case of tam, we've learned this in virtually every daf. I mean, what are you telling us something new here? It has to be something novel. So you can't be telling us the obvious. So it's saying, look, it's not obvious. So it's talking about a case of muad. So we're saying, hang on, with the case of muad, this doesn't even make sense. In muad, there's 2 points. If you looked after the animal successfully well and did a super superior guarding on it, and you did a normal looking after the animal, and at the end of the day, the animal gored, it's because, for example, either that the animal in other words, Akiva, let me put it to you like this, because you weren't there. Say you looked after the animal super well. It's a muad animal, technically, but you locked it up, lock and key and everything else. Then at the end of the day, some thieves came in and broke into the house and let the animal out and robbed things. That's an unavoidable accident. So for muad, then you'd pay nothing because it's not your fault. If you fail to look after the animal, you owe full payment damages. It's not half damages. What are we talking about? So we learn let me just share my screen. All right, so Akiva, we learn for the first time a new concept. There's not just looking after or not looking after. It's more complicated than that, okay? There's something called a lesser guarding. So a lesser guarding is actually the proper manner of guarding. So that might sound like a contradiction in terms. What do we mean? Is that a proper guarding, it's basically when you close a door and it can stand in ordinary wind. Normal ordinary wind. Are you with me? Now there's something called a superior guarding, which means you basically bolt the doors. You've got a thick door. It can stand extreme condition of twofold. Very heavy winds, as well as the animal trying to bang and get out at the same time. In other words, you've got an extra mile. We're not talking about a gale force wind where it can take your house down, because we learned then with the torda of fire and the torda of pit when it actually lands in fire, when it's in propulsion, is that if you put a stone, a knife, and a burden on a roof and there's an extraordinary wind, like a gale force wind that takes it off, you're not liable. That's an unavoidable accident. But if it's a normal wind, you should have taken that into account. Then you're liable. We're not talking about where there's no house left. We're talking about, and you've got to do a superior guarding, because you've got to assume that the animal's trying to get out, or you might have an extreme weather condition within reason. So there's 2 opinions, and I showed it with the guys last time. There's Mishnah 45b and there's 55b. I shared it with the guys. So Rabbi Meir says that for both a tam and a muad, you need a superior guarding. Means you need to go the extra mile, and you're liable for that. And Rabbi Yehuda says that the tam requires a superior guarding, but a muad a lesser guarding. Okay? Now that should strike you as weird. Why should it strike you as weird that the tam requires a superior guarding, but a muad lesser guarding? You should, logic should tell you this, kids.
Because it's only dependent on whether the extreme conditions or not.
Okay, so let me maybe guide you and give you a bit of a clue. It's only fair to you. If I say to you that a muad is an animal that's habitually crazy and gored and has got a shocking track record, or there's an animal that's relatively tame, where do you think you should be more stringent?
Where the animal is more wild.
Absolutely. So that's what Rav Yehuda, when you first read it, one battles to understand. So there was a reason Gavin supposed, which is actually correct, that is actually supported by some of the commentaries that said, look, with Muad, you obviously, and this actually supports Rabbi Meir, obviously when the animal is aggressive by nature and has had track records and the owner's been warned that you have to have a superior guarding. That goes without saying. So that's why Rav Meir says, for Muad, for sure, superior guarding, but you wouldn't think with a tam, you have to put in that much effort. And that's why the biblical verse, actually, you do have to. That's exactly why in the biblical verse you do have to, because you wouldn't think so. So that's why it has to tell you explicitly. And Rabbi Yehuda rules that tam is superior guarding because it says it in the biblical verse, but it doesn't mention it in the biblical verse with regards to muad. So he holds for muad you can get a lesser guarding, just whatever suffices, closing the door, etc. Because it doesn't mention it explicitly in the Chumash with regards to the muad, only the tam. So therefore he takes it literally. Rabbi Meir says it's obvious for muad you don't have to mention it because the animal's aggressive and crazy. But for tam you have to mention it because in the Exodus, because that's the chidush. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So that being the case, guys, we are saying very clearly that look, at the end of the day, guys, you're sending links while we're doing the show. It's popping up on our screen. Don't put anything on the group yet.
That was me, just getting the fast times for you guys from the Hebrew Cal.
Okay, just wait till the end of the show. All right. So the thing of it is, where does this what does this basically mean? Akiva, is as follows: as it says, look, Rava brings an explanation, and he says, look, as far as we're actually speaking about a muad case here, okay? So what do we mean by a muad case here? Is that, look, we're saying that a muad, basically a muad, you can suffice with a lesser guarding. In other words, you can close the door. So Rav Yaakov speaks regarding a muad for whose damage one normally pays in full, and with what case are we dealing with? Where the case where the owner performed a lesser guarding, okay, and didn't perform a superior guarding. So Rav Yaakov holds like Rav Yehuda, who said the tam portion of a muad ox remains in its place. So what are we saying, Akiva? We've never dealt with this with you before, is that Rav Yehuda holds as follows. Most of the sages rule that, look, for tam you pay from the body of the attacking animal, and for muad you pay from choice property. Okay? But what we learned is Rav Yehuda says no. For tam, for muad, the tam portion remains in its place. So say you've got an ox that's worth 200 zuz, and my ox is worth 80 zuz, but it's a good aimer, and it kills your ox in the heart, and your ox is dead. Okay, and your carcass we'll make the case simple, your carcass isn't worth anything of your dead ox, because let's not go into that subject. That's a different subject that we've addressed at length. So you don't get your carcass is worth nothing. So if my ox is muad, I owe you 200 zuz, right? But it's tam. So if it's tam, I only owe you 80 zuz, because even though your damages are half payment, which means I should owe you 100 zuz, because my attacking ox is a puny ox, I owe you to the maximum capacity of my attacking ox, which would be 80 zuz. Could be up to half, but it could be less if my ox that attacks you is puny. So Rav Yehuda says, hang on a second, my ox is muad. So I would owe you from the body of the attacking animal the 80 zuz. So I'll give you my ox that straightforwardly. So my ox is worth 80, but because it's muad, I have to pay that 120 zuz remainder from choice property or cash. Okay. The rest of the sages say, Akiva, that at the end of the day, I need to give you 200 zuz from choice property, okay, or cash. Rav Yehuda is saying, no, I give you from the gufa of the attacking animal the tam portion, which would be, in this case, the 80 zuz, and the 120 zuz I make good from choice property or cash. Fine. So now we're learning, hang on a second, what does that have to do with this case? So if you're saying that the animal had a lesser guarding, it means that according to Rabbi Yehuda, he's saying that you can have a lesser guarding for muad, but a more stringent guarding for tam. Okay? So what does that actually mean? Guys, you want to explain it to Akiva, or you want me to explain it? You can explain it with pleasure. Guys, any of you?
Is it related? Okay, Gavin.
No, you go ahead.
Is it related to that muad? They know already that there's that the level of damages. It's they're liable for damages anyway. The owner of the muad ox.
No, well, we're saying something a little bit different.
They know that what the liability is already, so that's so it's not going to make a difference in terms of how stringently it's guarded or not.
Explain what you mean. You're on the right track.
There's because it's muad, it's now liable usually for full damages. Usually.
Okay.
Yeah, well, usually. So the tam ox potentially can become muad, so that's why it needs to be guarded more stringently. So when it's muad, it's then liability will be double. It's half damages.
No. Going off track, but you were on the right track.
Okay.
So Akiva, Gav, you want to say something, or can?
No, you can go ahead.
All right, so Akiva, this is the bottom line. The animal was guarded not as properly as it could have been. So then, according to the Chumash, you're not really responsible. You don't have to do a superior guarding if it's muad. If you do a lesser guarding for muad, you're off the hook for muad. So you don't have to pay basically the muad portion. You only have to pay, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the tam portion, because the tam portion actually requires a more stringent guarding according to a verse in Shmot. Okay? So there you can't get off the hook for that part. So you're off the hook for the muad part, but not for the tam part. So the tam part remains in its place. So in other words, because if you never looked after it at all, you'd pay full damages, okay? And those full damages would be from the body of the attacking animal, which would be 80 zuz, and I'd have to give you 120 zuz of choice property or cash. Then I made up the 200 zuz. But I did guard it. I didn't bolt the door and have like super steel and everything like that. So I was partially negligent. Therefore, the muad part I don't have to pay, but the tam requires a proper guarding, a more stringent guarding, and therefore the tam I can't get away with. So there I pay from the body of the attacking animal. Rabbi Meir says no, for a muad, there's no lesser guarding. It's as stringent. So therefore, I would pay you all of it from choice property. But if we're holding according to Rav Yehuda, he says, no, the choice property is only for the balance of the money, the balance. The tam still gets paid. If there's anything owing for muad, I pay that from choice property or cash. Okay. So it says, Rava is quoting Rav Yaakov, and it says Rav Yaakov is in agreement with Rav Yehuda, which says the tam muad portion of a muad ox remains in its place. So fine. That's how we get to Rav Yaakov turning around and saying you pay half payment damages, because according to Rava, there was a lesser guarding, so you don't have to pay for the muad portion. You just have to pay for the tam portion. And it's still a chiddush for us because we never knew that for muad it's possible to pay half payment damages. But it is in this case if there's a lesser guarding, because then you're still responsible for the superior guarding part of the tam, but the muad part you're off the hook. Does that make sense? So Rav Yaakov and Rav Yehuda in agreement according to Rava. But Abaya isn't happy with this. This is the review. Abaya says, listen, they don't agree. Because basically, Rav Yehuda says you pay full payment damages, and Rav Yaakov say you half payment damages. So he's saying they don't agree. And the Gemara then responds to Abai and says, look, they do, because if they disagree, they're saying, this rabbi says so and so, and this rabbi says so and so. Then you're having an argument. That's how Gemara is set up. But if it's saying that Rav Yaakov concurs with the Rav Yehuda, it's saying he does agree. So the Gemara is saying, no. They both agree that there has to be a payment, but they disagree in terms of how much. Okay? Rav Yehuda says full payment. Rav Yaakov says half payment. So what case are we talking about here? We're saying, look, we're talking about the same case where there was, but it's slightly different. Okay? So we're saying, hang on, we're dealing with a case here where the owner basically left it entirely unguarded. Okay, it's a muad case. So that's why Rav Yaakov, so in other words, you have Rava explaining it like that, and the buyer saying, no, listen, I'm explaining it differently. Rav Yaakov is not in agreement with Rav Yehuda at all. Okay, not at all. He's basically saying, I say half payment damage, and Rav Yehuda says full payment damage. So a buyer is saying we're talking about a different case. We're talking about a case, a muad case, but the ox was left entirely unguarded. So now you can understand why Rav Yehuda says you pay full payment damages, Akiva, because if you leave an ox fully unguarded, what happens? If it's muad, you pay full, right? So he's saying, yes, you pay full. So how does Rav Yehuda say you pay full? He says, look, the tum portion remains in its place, and that you pay from the attacking animal. So in our case, we said, I'd give you over my animal, my puny little animal at 80 zuz, and I'd have to make good of 120 zuz with choice property or cash. So Rav Yehuda says you got paid in full. Rav Yaakov said, he says you pay half. What do you mean you pay half? So the Gemara says it agrees, Rav Yaakov agrees with Rav Yehuda in one respect and not with another. In what respect does he agree with Rav Yehuda? That basically the tum portion...
Sorry.
Okay. So he's saying that basically the tum portion, so Rav Yaakov agrees with Rav Yehuda that the tum portion remains in his place. Those two are in agreement in terms of how things are paid. Most of the other rabbis say it's all paid for muad from choice property. Rav Yaakov is saying, I agree with Rav Yehuda. Tum portion remains in its place, and the balance is paid with choice property. Akiva, are you with me? Everybody's doing something else.
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
All right.
Just putting some earphones in.
Sure, no problem. Okay. So, Akiva, we're saying that generally the rabbis don't agree with Rav Yehuda. They all say that you pay choice property for all muad damages. The whole amount is paid with choice property or cash. Rav Yehuda and Rav Yaakov agree on one statement, that you pay the tum portion from the attacking ox, and the balance, the shortfall, you make good with choice property or cash. So in that point, Abaya says they're in agreement. But there's a case where Rav Yaakov doesn't agree with Rav Yehuda. What case does he not agree? He says, look, I don't believe that a court has appointed the agent to collect from tum damages. Because Rav Yehuda has turned around and said he agrees with the sages, because the sages say that for mental incompetence, the agent of the court has the power to collect tum damages. So Rav Yehuda agrees with all the sages there. And Rabbi Yaakov agrees with Sumchus. And Sumchus says the agent is not empowered to collect tum damages. And that in that point she disagrees. So he says, how's the half payment damages made from what? Well, Rav Yaakov says we pay the half payment damages from the muad portion, but we cannot collect from the tum damages. for mental incompetence because the agent of the court doesn't have the power to collect for the tam. And that's why in this case where the agent of the court for mental incompetence damaged under his watch and it's muad, you can't collect the tam portion, but you can collect the muad portion. That's a biased explanation of the discussion between Rav Yehuda and Rav Yaakov. Okay, let's just quickly go on. So he was saying, so what has to remain in place? So basically, according to Abaya, when Rav Yaakov rules that the owner must pay damages, he refers not to the half damage payment of tam, but to the half damage payment of muad. So he says you can't forget about the tam collection with regard to mental incompetence. The agent doesn't have the power to collect. And Rav Yehuda says he does have the power to collect. I agree with the sages. So Rav Abaya said to Ravina, okay, according to Abaya, who said that Rav Yaakov and Rav Yehuda disagree, all is well. In other words, his interpretation of Rav Yaakov's brasa as discussing a muad is good. It makes sense. But according to Abaya, Rav Yaakov holds that we do not appoint an agent in the case of a tam, and that's his dispute with Rav Yehuda. Perforce is half damage payment regards to the muad. You pay for the muad portion. But according to Rava, who said that Rav Yaakov and Rav Yehuda do not disagree. Okay, what it's saying is they do not disagree in 2 points, in that they both agree that the tam portion remains in the place, and according to Rava, that both Rav Yaakov and Rav Yehuda agree that the agent can collect half payment damages for the tam portion for mental incompetence. Okay, so it says, fine, let us establish it as speaking of a tam, but we said in the beginning it doesn't make sense for one reason. Is because we said that there wouldn't have been anything that the Gemara would have taught you. We know that you pay for tam. So we say, no, it's still a chiddush, because we didn't know that the court appoints agents for collecting for tam for mental incompetence. So we did learn something. So it's not a normal case where we didn't learn anything. Obviously, you pay half damages for tam for a normal person, but we didn't know that the court can appoint agents with regards to mental incompetence for that collection. So we still learned something according to that opinion. And that was the explanation given of Rav Abaya, explanation of Rava, okay? So now we're saying, hang on a second, that's fine. But let's just get this clear. According to Rabbi Yehuda, who mandates superior guarding for a tam, we can interpret this as speaking of a case where he performed a lesser guarding on the ox and did not perform a superior guarding on it, meaning the muad falls away. You don't have to do a superior guarding for a muad. For a lesser guarding, it suffices in muad, so you're not responsible for the muad, but it doesn't suffice for the tam, so you have to pay for a tam damage. And then we say, hang on a second, Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov said that a lesser guarding suffices for a tam. So according to Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov, we say he didn't guard the animal at all. Either way, whichever way you interpret it, you're liable for the half damages and tam. Okay? And then it says that, what has it taught us? It's still teaching us that with regards to mental incompetence, you do appoint an agent for the damaged party to collect from the animal's body. So that's the chiddush. So basically, the Brisa says, well, why didn't Rava interpret it in that way? Why did Rava interpret it as muad? So Ravina answers, he said to Rav Abaya, this is what Rava wishes to say, that Rav Yaakov teaches one ruling that has two underlying reasons. So his ruling is that if it's muad owned by a deaf, mute, deranged person or a minor, you pay half damages. Okay? The two underlying reasons are, one, that the muad requires a lesser guarding so that muad responsibility falls away and the tam portion remains in its place. And then number two, you appoint an agent in the case of the tam. So that's Rava's explanation on Rav Yaakov. So that's defending Rava's approach. So when the Gemara turns to a biased explanation, we dealt with it with Rabbi Bar Ula. What did Rabbi Bar Ula say, guys? He said the following. He said, look, at the end of the day, he was talking about a case where the muad portion remains intact because the person didn't look after their ox at all. And he's saying that the tam portion falls away. Why? Because according to Abaya, Rav Ula's explanation of Abaya is that Rav Yaakov doesn't hold that the court has the power, the court's agent has the power to collect on tam, and Rav Yehuda says he does. So you collect the tam in that case, and you collect obviously the muad portion because the ox wasn't guarded at all. Rav Yaakov says he agrees that the tam remains in its place, but the court-appointed agent doesn't have the power to collect, according to Abaya, Rav Ula's explanation of Abaya, and therefore only the muad portion remains in its place. Now, Rava has got a different explanation. Sorry, Ravina. He said an issue between Rav Yaakov and Rav Yehuda is when it comes under a new jurisdiction. Basically, that's the issue. Because what happens is these people have returned with their faculties. So what's happening is as follows, Akiba, is we're saying, look, if the owner was overseas, or you've got a mentor incompetent that regains their faculties, it goes from the court-appointed agent's jurisdiction. In other words, the court-appointed agent had his own farm, and now it goes back to the owner. So Rav Yehuda says that despite the change in jurisdiction, the ox remains in its present muad state, and that's why you pay full payment damages. But according to Rav Yaakov, coming under new jurisdiction alter the animal status. It now reverts back to being a tam, so the owner can only pay half damages. Does that make sense? So Ravina says it has nothing to do with any other case except a jurisdictional issue. That's all it is. It's a jurisdictional issue. So the minute the person regains their faculties and it changes jurisdiction basically back to the person that was either overseas or mentally incompetent, it goes back to tam. And that's why Rav Yaakov says you pay half payment damages. And Rav Yehuda says it doesn't change its status, it remains muad. And that's why you pay full damages. So that's the whole explanation. And now we're at 40a2. So we've done a whole review on daf on the 39th daf, and we're on 40a2. Okay? So I wanted to leave it on that note and not go into new issues. Is there any questions?
So, Damon, so there's a dispute there. You said two rabbis. One says if the jurisdiction changes, it should revert back to tam, but the other one says it remains muad if it was already muad before the person regained normality, so to speak. So that's
yes.
What's the defining? Okay, we're coming. Yeah.
Hang on. In answer to your question, we dealt with this in the beginning of the daf. It was an argument originally between Sumchus and the rabbis. So Sumchus said, if it goes back to the jurisdiction of the mental incompetents that have gained their faculties, it goes back to being tam. Okay? Yeah. That's what we learned originally, and the sages says it stays muad. And Rav Yehuda agrees with the sages, and Rav Yaakov actually agrees with Sumchus. That's what Ravina is saying. And that's why you pay half payment damages.
Yeah. So what's the overriding factor? What's the overriding? What's the rule then?
So the rule
it remains muad. Doesn't revert back to tam.
Well, it depends who you're holding by. By the way, there's a thing in the Rambam's book. In the Rambam's got a book called Mishnah Torah, which takes every single Gemara and gives you the halachas about how the Rambam holds. For some reason, I said to you, a lot of Chabad people I know seem to have that book for the Rambam from Mishnah Torah, which is fascinating. One day we must go through this, because at the end of Bava Kamma, I'd like to spend a week showing you on every daf what the halacha is, so that you're coming away with something tangible. Because I think the Rambam is the most recent source. that we can hold that he takes every daf and tells you what the halacha is. Akiva?
So I didn't know that book existed. Sounds remarkable.
And that's the definitive ruling. Whatever the Rambam says is definitive. That's it.
Yeah, I would reckon he's the most modern. So I think that would be in cases. I mean, in a case of Rava and Abaya, you've got cases of Rav and Shmuel and all sorts of other cases. So you've got a lot of different sections that are interplaying with each other. I thought we were already on 48.2, so we covered a bit of that and the whole of the 39th daf review. Shama Kiva, you were left out, but I hope you got just a bit of a sense of it.
You're on mute. So Damon, so that what you're saying that the Rambam gives the final word, so to speak, on all the halachot. What he says, that's it. He gives the final say. He he brings it to finality.
Yeah, I think that's important. So at the end of it, we're coming. I think in the Gemara we're just discussing all the possibilities and all the viewpoints. So we've got sumchus and the rabbis. We've got an issue of does the agent pay, do the mental incompetence pay? We have an issue of jurisdictional alteration from the agent back to the case of the mental incompetence that have gained their faculties. We've got a case now about do you pay tam damages? Because this whole argument, don't you pay from tam damages, is because in the case of movable property, minors don't pay. You only pay fixed property. That's how this whole case came, that the court-appointed agent can't collect from tam damages. And then we said, no, as far as damages are concerned, or as far as creditors are concerned, you can't. But as far as damages are concerned, you can, because that's a different case. That's not a case between two people. That's a case where, anarchy can run amok and people can just be damaged. So in that case, we're more stringent. So we say, how do we hold there? By sumchus or by the rabbis? Sumchus says that the court-appointed agent can't collect tam damages. The rabbis say you can. Rabbi Yehuda says you can. Rav Yaakov says you can't. So he seems to agree, according to Abai and Ravina, with sumchus on two notes: jurisdictional change in terms of mu'at to tam, and also in terms of that you can't collect tam damages at all. Whereas Rava says that Rav Yehuda and Rav Yaakov are in simpatico, they're in the same mindset, that the tam portion remains in this place and you can collect tam damages. So that's the bottom line of everything in a sentence.
Wow.
All right, guys, I hope you don't mind, but we're already on 48.2. We've done enough. Are you pleased we did a review of the previous stuff or not?
Very good. Must have helped that keep it.
All right. Guys, listen, it's going to get much more interesting and it's quite simple going forward. Kevin, you're in time to watch the soccer and even get yourself a snacking.
No, I actually got work. I'm not interested in who's playing. Tomorrow is more interesting. Okay.
So this came on longer then, eh? I thought we were stopping for the soccer. I don't need to